Welcome to a new episode of The Deep End. This one features a conversation with ODF alum, co-founder and CEO of Cal.com, Bailey Pumfleet. This is a really interesting conversation because Cal.com is a really interesting company. They make it so anyone can do scheduling any way that they like. Everything from creating a simple scheduling link that you can share with someone to book time with you, all the way through to building very sophisticated scheduling inside of an application, everything ranging from SaaS to marketplaces, healthcare, you name it. And Cal really nails sort of the whole lot of the use cases, and that's why they're growing so quickly. And more on that in a second, but I think that the thing that is making this conversation even more of a must listen is Bailey and his philosophy on company building. He shares a lot of his experiences building an open source, building communities around open source, how to think about building companies if you're thinking about building open source companies. He also touches on how to think about building infrastructure companies and how Cal has done a lot to make it so that people can trust that it will exist and continue to be there to power the infrastructure inside of whatever it is that they're building. The last thing that I think is really unique in this conversation is Bailey touching on company culture. Cal is a completely remote company, and I believe that Bailey is maybe one of the only one or two teammates who's even in the US at the moment. And I think there's something that's super interesting about Cal in that they have built this incredible company that grows really quickly, and they've done it in their own way, not just remotely, but also in terms of how they operate. For instance, they have a lot of their information publicly available. Their metrics, the salaries and compensation that a lot of the teammates have, they've just really chosen to do everything their own way, and it really is special. So I hope you enjoy that part of this episode. And two things before we jump into the conversation that I think are worth touching on. As I was mentioning, Bailey was an ODF alum, and his co-founder, Pierre, also did ODF. Pierre did ODF 6, Bailey did ODF 9. And ODF is the place to go when you're exploring what's next. When you're exploring starting a company, you're trying to figure out who might you want to build with, what might you build, who might the initial customers be, just who can you have in your corner and as a support system when you're building this company. Because starting a company is super fun, it's exciting, but it could also be lonely, isolating, and anxiety-inducing. And the idea of being around other people who are at the exact same stage as you is really amazing. So that's what we do. ODF happens 4 times a year. The next one kicks off early next year. We'd love to see your application. Join ODF.com. We'll put that in the show notes as well. And then the last thing that we'll talk about before we get into the conversation with Bailey is StampList. StampList is a resource that we've created where we curate the best companies, the fastest growing companies, the ones that we think have an opportunity to just become massive successes. And we curate companies that are doing great work, that are sponsoring incredible talent for visas to come and work in America, or in Cal.com's case, to actually come anywhere in the world and build and be a part of their company. So StampList, we'll put it in the show notes, but I think that there's something even more exciting beyond just the visa stuff, which is unique to Cal that I just heard about. Not only do they sponsor visas for their teammates, but they also do this really interesting relocation package. And I think that relocation is such an interesting phenomenon when you're a remote company. So I'll put in the show notes about that. I just discovered this a couple days ago, and I thought it was absolutely fascinating. But it just goes to show what a unique company Cal.com is. And again, you're going to hear a lot about what makes them special. I think you're going to really enjoy it. So without further ado, let's hop into this conversation with Bailey Pumfleet.
The problem is there's so many people that just kind of go in the wrong direction of open source. I get people come to me and they're like, oh, I'm building an open source company. I'm like, okay, what are you building? They're like, I'm building an open source Ticketmaster. And I say, why are you building an open source Ticketmaster? And they're like, because I saw you guys did open source and you did well. And I'm like, okay, but tell me, why does open source help here? And they're like, people could self-host it. I'm like, why does that help?
Ticketmaster,
get to the core of why do people care about this? And for us, we were very intentional about why we did open source, and there is good reason why people should care about us being open source. But I feel we're generally a pretty good leading light for this, but there's also plenty of other open source companies that have gone and done well, and people look to us to try and blindly follow that playbook without really understanding why the playbook is there in the first place. So I think that's something that like doesn't get spoken about that much, about like what are the drawbacks of open source and things like that. You know, everybody's out here being incredibly bullish on it, but there are plenty of drawbacks and things that you really do have to consider before you actually start a commercial open source company.
So you're already recording. This is it. Like, we're on now. So this is a great way to kick it off. The what you just said, though, actually reminds me in some ways of, people just applying open source to whatever. Kind of reminds me of people applying Web3 or crypto to whatever.
Fun story. Yes. Yeah.
Though it's I think that a lot of people struggle even more with Web3 and sort of the value add component. Web3 Ticketmaster, now they say about it, that actually sounds like a better idea than an open source Ticketmaster, perhaps. But
yeah, we all love jumping on hype trains. I mean, who doesn't? But there's a thing like, do you want to just limit that to being a sensible side project? God, I love, experimenting with new things. And, since AI has come out, I've obviously built some really random side projects, like meeting transcription and like note taking. I mean, there's plenty of things out there. But there's a difference between like playing around with this at home and, actually trying to launch a company on this, because I think, AI is an exception. AI is genuinely something where, okay, don't squeeze every possible use case of AI into, every product, but AI is generally the most applicable one. Whereas like Web3 or open source, these are things that are designed for a very specific purpose. And you've really got to make sure that what you're doing fits in with that. If you want to build something that is very much aligned with Web3, do it. Don't be scared away from building in Web3, but also don't take the most random consumer things that don't need to be Web3 for people that don't even understand Web3 and just try and like force it in there just because it's the current trend. And that's been something which is, I mean, we saw the amount of Web3 startups that came about and then they just died. And obviously nobody wants to see a startup die. And I think a lot of that can be avoided by just being a lot more sort of have more sustainable thinking. Think about like, where does this tie in? Is this going to survive the next 10 years? I did the same thing when the whole AI wave came out. I was like, okay, I'm cautious to jump into it because I don't want this to be the next Web3 or anything like that. And I thought to myself, is this something where I really see it being important in people's lives in 10 years? Are people going to care 10 years down the line that this is an AI product? If yes, then go for it. And like I said, AI is probably one of our best, sort of hype trains, one of the most credible hype trains almost.
It feels closer to the internet than, say, Web3 or something like that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And open source will always be around, has always been around, will always be around. Recently, with the wave of companies like Cal.com or many other that have had like commercial open source success, there's been a recent spike. If you think about it, GitLab and plenty of other open source companies have been around for a while. But the thing is GitLab they're a corporate, they're publicly traded and they don't seem super relatable. Nobody thinks about, I'm going to build the next Microsoft. You think, you're going to build the next, whatever startup. And Cal.com and many others are those examples of commercial open source startups that have been at least somewhat successful. And I think a lot of people look at that as like an achievable goal and then are like, okay, yeah, let's jump on this hype train. And that's why we see this recent spike, maybe starting like last few years. We've seen specific commercial open source VC funds spring up. We also see pretty much every single VC nowadays, they're taking much more of a focus on open source. Even if their mission, even if their website says nothing about open source, they are going into GitHub trending. They are like combing through projects, trying to identify the next big commercial open source thing. So yeah, the hype train is very much here with open source. It's now the time just to be careful about how we navigate that.
So people are navigating this in a very interesting way. As you're saying, there's like the open source focused funds. There are people who are just trying to slap open source on anything. There are some people who are probably, I imagine, who are kind of OGs of the open source space who are maybe decrying kind of like the commercialization and sort of this blended aspect of open source software and, business that has a profit seeking, objective. We can talk about that. But, one thing that's just interesting is maybe we can juxtapose when Cal.com, which was originally called Calendso, which is, Cal.com's a better name, by the way. But Calendso will always live in my heart. There was this time when maybe people weren't browsing the GitHub leaderboards, for a number of stars and all that, and sort of like using that as a heat-seeking method, tactic for deal flow. What was it like when you launched Calendso, now Cal.com? What was the world like then?
Yeah, open source is a delicate thing. It's not something that should be overly exploited for commercial use. There's a very, very fine line as to what is going to build you a profitable company and, one that will do successful in a business sense, and something that will also not anger the true open source activists. And like you say, there have been people around in open source forever. And the core of it is truly free software. Yeah. And this is the thing. Our model is that everything that a reasonable individual may need is completely free and open source. But then we only lock the things that undoubtedly only like a commercial company is going to use. Like no individual needs like SAML single sign-on or any like crazy enterprise feature. And that's something which is really interesting to see, because when we started out, open source was a lot more pure, so to say. Sure. Whereas nowadays there's a lot more people that are looking to kind of exploit open source as a growth hack. And to be perfectly honest, I would be lying if I said that open source wasn't a form of a growth hack. Mm-hmm. We did not become open source because it's a growth hack, but a lot of people are doing so nowadays. And that is a very dangerous thing. Open source is a great way to get people initially interested in your product. Everybody loves something for free. Open source as well is such a tight-knit community. Everybody knows everybody there. But you've just got to be so careful that you don't look like somebody that's just like, you're building a business, but you're just like sprinkling in open source just because that's going to get you some initial traction. While it may get you some initial traction, that is not a sustainable business model. And at the end of the day, that's going to become a downfall for you, because open source has many drawbacks. Much like any hype train, nobody really realizes the drawbacks here of what we're doing. Who knows? Like AI is wonderful, but on the downside, all this new compute power we're using may emit so many greenhouse gases from the data centers, and it's going to,
Sure.
AI could like kill our environment, but we're not looking at the downsides because we're in the middle of the hype train. Open source, people see the upside as the growth hack, but the downside is that open source can significantly undermine your commercial offering. And that's something we also had to be very, very, very careful to navigate, because you can jump on sales calls with customers and they say, okay, why should I pay you $100K a year or whatever for a license when I can just, self-host this for free? And you have to have a decent answer to that. And the problem is, if you don't have a decent answer to that, brick by brick, everything, starts crumbling down. You need to have a good business strategy to succeed and to raise money and things like that. And what investors, some are looking for this, some are a little bit carried away by the hype, much like if you've got an AI product for anything, sure, you're going to get checks thrown at you. But especially as we go into a while of, open source, or commercial open source rather, being around, is people are going to start to ask, what is your business strategy? You need a solid thing behind that. And I think the days are definitely fading where you can just get money thrown at you. And I know from speaking to a lot of VCs who have invested in open source and really invested along with this whole hype train, that they now look years later and they say, oh dear, all these portfolio companies of mine, they were launching the next open source intercom. But it's 2 years later, and all they've done is built an open source copy of intercom. And obviously, intercom is a very solid product. It's been around for a while. It's doing pretty well. They have resources behind them. And it's like 2 years later, they're just an alternative. And that's the thing for Cal.com. Although, day one were kind of a Calendly alternative, the long-term thing is never to be an alternative. We had a plan to completely supersede them. And that's something which I find is generally lacking in a lot of open source companies. They think that just being an open source alternative to whatever is going to win.
Why do they think that?
Because they think that people care about like the self-hosting, care about it being open source. But I mean, there's like benefits of open source, self-hosting, privacy, things like that. Your data's secure. But at the end of the day, like say we build an open source Twitter. Somebody who built that will say it's great because it's open source. You have privacy now.
Yeah, most people don't care about that.
Does the worldwide consumer market care about privacy?
Yeah.
No, they don't. Or for open source intercom or something like that, do I really care that I can self-host it? Hell no. I'm building a startup. I don't want to start spinning up resources in AWS and try and have a sysadmin configure this and maintain this. No, I just want to pay intercom and it's done. You've got to be able to clearly communicate a real tangible benefit to your company. And then the thing which you'll notice is whenever I pitch Cal.com, I always never say open source.
Same. What do you say then? Yeah.
I'm telling you about how it's a better product.
Yeah.
I'm saying all the ways that we win on great user experience, on this, on that, on these feature sets. And the only time I'll bring up open source is if you say to me, hi, I'm this government agency, or I am like a Fortune 500 that has the strictest data privacy controls, or a bank or something like that. And I will say, oh, well, we're open source, so you can self-host. And you can also audit the code to make sure we're not doing anything dodgy with your calendar data. But at the end of the day, it's not really the open source part that's important there. The important part is satisfying your privacy and compliance requirements. Open source is just the way that we do that. I think as well, if you look at Atlassian or something like that, they've offered self-hosted products for, say, 10 or so years. They recently shut it down and moved to cloud. But, they had a decent market in just companies that want to self-host these things. Whenever I talk with most government agencies and those kind of legacy things, they're probably using they're not using Google Workspace like the rest of us. They're using some on-premises Exchange mail server that's firewalled, that you can't access it outside the organization. And I'm okay, open source is a great thing for you because, you can self-host this on your network. It's a way just to unlock a solution for somebody. It's not the core of why we are who we are. And as you'll notice, I'd love to sort of go back on the Internet Archive and look at, day one Calendso, which was the open source Calendly alternative. Because, of course, that was the way which we explained what we did to people. We weren't better at product than Calendly on day one, of course not. So we were just the open source Calendly alternative, and that described what we do. But over time, it went from open source is no longer the headline. Open source is somewhere in the page. Then we move along a bit more. And then open source is something in the footer, to the point that today you look at our landing page and we're just talking about what we do as a product. We talk about the things that people care about.
Yeah.
And for Cal.com is supposed to be used by everyone. It's almost, a consumer product in some way. Sure. And to think of that, when I go ask anybody that could use Cal.com, a barbershop, a doctor, even my grandma to schedule a call with me, from back home, call me here. And I say to them, we're an open source Calendly alternative. What?
Yeah.
I don't know what that means. I say, we're something that makes it super easy to find time with anyone. It's never been easier to find time across time zones, depending on, what's on your calendar. And then they're like, okay, yeah, I get what you mean. Open source isn't a descriptor. And I think you'll find very few use cases where people care about open source. If you're building like a very deep developer product where open source is going to bring a significant feature to it, like something that needs to be highly customizable, okay. If it's the Linux kernel or something like that, where, Linux gets adapted to run on every little thing from, traffic light systems to embedded devices, sure, open source, great.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like, is Linux going to be the next Stripe, the next Airbnb? No, like, we're out building products. Yeah. And of course, there are wonderful things at the infrastructure level that can be built there, but people are trying to take that and put that into the startup world we live in.
So the reason I reached out to have you on this podcast was because of all the crazy stuff that was happening in open source, and sort of this world where there's sort of the commercial open source side of things. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's just so funny how it seems like I reached out to you because one thing was happening and then more stuff started to happen. But it seems like now is the right time to just have this kind of conversation we record where we're talking to pretty much a group of people who has some familiarity with open source, but probably not from the aspect of starting a business that utilizes open source. And now I know that you said you de-emphasize sort of the open source part of Cal.com because it's not sort of the feature. And then you say that a lot of people, or the core feature, and then you say a lot of people who sort of try and do, Cal.com for intercom or something. They kind of make this category error where they say, okay, I'm going to superficially copy this idea, right? In the same way almost that somebody would do like Uber for dogs or something, right? Where they're like, okay, that Uber thing is working really well for them. They're doing really well. A lot of people like Uber. It's got this idea that you push a button and something happens in the real world. So let's apply that, Uber for dogs, right? And then you're kind of probably having something similar happen with people who are starting these open source, Cal.com for X, where it's like, okay, I superficially understand what Cal.com is. It's this open source version of Calendly, which just isn't actually factual, but that's sort of how people view it. Then they go out there and they say, okay, so I'm just going to do open source version of Intercom, as you're saying, but they don't really understand like the underlying why behind why you did it and sort of how you did it. So I think that like part of the goal today might be to make it so that people understand a little bit more about how you thought about that. Because obviously you are open source and you were open source back then. And that was a big sort of part to your story in the beginning. But like, if people want to create more great companies and open source might be a good avenue with which to do that, I think it would be great and very helpful for them to understand it. But right now it kind of feels, I studied music and I play music, and I look at a lot of bands that are kind of, or artists that are kind of just like copycats of like somebody who actually did something really unique and special. And like, I really like Bob Dylan, and Bob Dylan, he sort of revolutionized this era of music, right? In the 60s. And then how many people came after him just copying exactly what he did, but not actually being that good because they didn't really understand the underlying sort of like logic and inspiration and stuff that actually went into it. So they just kind of sounded like this superficial copy, but it didn't have all of like the deep inner sort of workings that like actually made Bob Dylan. I kind of feel like that's the way that the world works when people try and do Uber for dogs or Cal.com for intercom. They don't really understand like the deep, almost like, in the music world, it's almost like this spiritual sort of like deep underpinnings and like the inspiration behind it. And I feel like that's just what's lacking. But I think that like for people to really understand Cal.com, I think they need to understand sort of the inspiration that you had. So what was the inspiration, that you had around open source? What was the actual kind of like motivation behind building this the way that you did in the early days? And that's the thing that I think people should understand more than just like, oh, you can clone some popular app and make it open source and then like try and bolt some business, model onto it.
Regardless of what you may or may not know Cal.com as, Cal.com is and always has been an infrastructure company. And although most people will sign up for this and use it as the free consumer product that it is, under the hood, we do infrastructure. And that's our tagline, scheduling infrastructure for absolutely everyone. And although ambitious, since day one, the idea is, why is it every time that you go and book a doctor's appointment, the time that you book an Airbnb or this sort of thing, why does this not all go through, one set of scheduling infrastructure? Because it's incredibly difficult to build scheduling. And sure, while Airbnb and the big companies can do that, for your average company, we estimate it takes over $1 million and over a year to build like an actual scheduling product. And that's even just in the early stages.
Yeah.
That doesn't cover a lot of the advanced use cases and things like that there are. And so the point is we're trying to be like Stripe for time, in the same way that, Stripe powers a significant portion of payments on the internet. We want to do the same with scheduling. And so that's the thing, to build something that's so deep in infrastructure, open source is a great way to do that. And earlier I mentioned Linux, and I mentioned about Linux being in all of these different things, that a lot of the devices that we interact with, whether we know it or not, they use Linux. When I turn on the TV and, it's got some smart TV operating system going on, it's using Linux under the hood. That is kind of why open source for us. We want something that's like under the hood, completely adaptable, completely customizable. We want people to be building on top of this to an even greater degree than Stripe. We're really striving for such a huge market share that honestly, I don't think many commercial companies have even achieved, because at the end of the day, everybody needs scheduling.
Time very important.
I would say we're in one of the most like generic and widely used business sectors there is. Like everybody needs to schedule something, and we should absolutely be there for that. And then that is the entire point of Cal.com. Honestly, I don't even mind if anybody signs up to Cal.com directly, has a Cal.com link.
Sure.
Although we try to grow it, it's a great marketing thing for us. Everybody's got the Cal.com link, they can book each other. Even if we didn't do that at all, and we were the ones that just silently under the hood, when you book your next Airbnb, you see it on their interface, but under the hood, it's doing all of the logic through Cal.com. We don't even need you to know that it was us. We can just be the silent partner in the background doing this. And that is where open source fits in. Open source is great for infrastructure projects. Whenever you want to build something into something else, I would say a good example is like in the world of game engines, Godot was like an open source game engine. And the point there is, Unity and Unreal, they're wonderful engines. But when you want to like deeply customize this stuff, if you're going to build like the next huge AAA title on this, if you look at what like Rockstar do with GTA 5 and things like that, they build their own custom engines, because to build something that's absolutely huge, you've got to build it the most custom thing there is. Same thing with like no-code web builders and things like that. That'll do you nicely at small scale, but nobody's building the next Airbnb or something like that on no-code. And it's the same thing, with like open source versus commercial. Or at the end of the day, you're going to build it yourself. And open source brings you very close to the level of flexibility of building it yourself. So if you're going to build the next AAA, with Godot, you can like customize a lot of things that are deep rooted within the engine, rather than just kind of operating in the kind of freedom layer, which you're allowed, on top of Unreal or Unity or something like that. And I find those at the deep infrastructure level is where the best opportunities for commercial open source are. And that's the thing. People look at Cal.com, and of course they know it through our general SaaS offerings, whether it's free individual links or whether it's our like Teams and enterprise SaaS offerings. But the real thing that we do under the hood is that infrastructure, that platform stuff. And that's the only part where it really matters, other than, selling to enterprises that need self-hosting. The only part where open source truly, truly matters is in the infrastructure stuff. And that's where I think the future lies. Even though I do discourage, don't just build your SaaS app open source, because why not?
Sure.
If you're building something in infrastructure, and you want it to be absolutely huge and absolutely like world changing, and you want to be the next Linux or something like that, then yeah, make it open source. Like that could be a very good, reason to go into that.
It's interesting how you have this analogy of Stripe for time, and it's just so fitting because people say that people with more money value their time much more than their money, right? So in some ways, you could argue that you're going to be more valuable than Stripe in that regard. It's just such a finite resource, and it's so important, and everybody has issues with time, no matter how much money they make, in fact. So it seems like such a huge opportunity. Why do you think nobody's like worked on this in any meaningful way before? Because I guess it almost feels like the Stripe story a little bit, where everybody who was building pre-Stripe knew just how hard it was to do payments, but yet nobody really made like a substantial effort, and especially a substantial effort to court developers, sort of like Stripe started with like startups first instead of trying to go to the enterprise first, right? And I think that they even famously were like, we're never going to be like serving Amazon as a customer. Right now they are, to some extent. But how did you think about that? Like, why wasn't anybody else doing this? Say something about that.
Yeah, there are definitely some similarities between our model and Stripe's model, and that's unintentionally. Yeah. I've never deeply looked into Stripe's story or their strategy or anything like that. We just like using the Stripe for time analogy because developers know what Stripe is. They know that payment processing is hard. I always tell people on sales calls, I'm like, well, you don't go and build payment processing yourself because that's going to be needlessly difficult. All you do is you throw them a few cents on the dollar and they handle it for you. We do the same thing. And this is the thing, everybody knows scheduling is hard. You ask any developer what their worst nightmare is, time zones. Everybody hates time zone logic. We tackled that, and it's definitely something very difficult. And part of assembling a great team was a team of people that can map out this insanely complex logic that handles, first of all, your time zones, then second of all, the ability in Cal.com to say, okay, I want to offer 15-minute meetings, but not back-to-back. I want a 10-minute buffer after each of them. And I don't want more than 2 meetings a day. And I don't want people to be able to book more than 2 weeks in the future. Although that seems simple, to actually combine all of that logic in the code to run through each of those options that you've set and then generate the list of times you're available is insanely complex logic. There are very, very good, respectable developers that have been around for 10, 20 years in this game, and they look at some of our like slot logic code, and they don't understand what's going on, which is crazy. Like, that's an incredible moat. And that's the same thing with Stripe. I'm at least somewhat a developer, and to think about like actually manually payment processing without something like that sounds like hell. And that's the thing, people are very willing to pay for things that they don't want to tackle themselves. And the thing with Stripe as well, and with us, is that we enable you to like focus on building your startup and not scheduling, for instance. That's the thing which I'm always telling people. I'm like, okay, do you want to build your telehealth marketplace, your find a job platform or something like that, or do you want to just build scheduling or build your product? It's such a simple question for people, and I think it's just something which really drives people to be like, okay, yeah, like I'm going to pull out my wallet for this. And that's the problem, really. A lot of these things exist. Mm-hmm. Do you want to maintain your own infrastructure and spin up servers and manage reverse proxies and Apache web server? No, like I'll just pay Vercel a stupid amount of money and I'll just host my thing. I can just like link my GitHub project and they'll just do it. Like Vercel costs an insane amount of money, but they still built a huge business because nobody wants to deal with this.
Yeah.
I think that they're another wonderful example, and they've got a different open source strategy where, you know, like through Next.js, they drive that. And I think this is something as well which ties in with what you said about Stripe with startups. You know, whoever it is, your goal is to capture people when they build, because then they'll scale to huge amounts and they will become the stickiest customers imaginable. Like Vercel built Next.js, a serverless first framework that everybody goes and builds their entire application on. And then really you've got to deploy it on Vercel, and it's only recently that there's now other deployment options. But otherwise it's like you can go host it on your own server, but it won't be serverless at that point. It'll run sort of like in a different mode. And it's like, well, of course you're just going to pay Vercel that way. You're not going to change a framework to something which is, you know, like, you don't want to rewrite the whole thing in PHP years later, of course. You're probably also not going to rip out all of your payment processing code, you know, to churn from Stripe to something else. Like, it's no secret that Stripe charge you more in fees than what, like, you could be paying if you use some kind of other, like, developer unfriendly API, you know, like, it's probably going to be terrible to work with as a dev, but you could probably shave off, if you're running a decent volume, you could shave off millions, but people still choose to pay the millions extra to Stripe because it makes sense. Same thing with scheduling. You know, you build your next huge product, all of your stuff rests on cal.com. Once you grow and once you scale up, you're never going to be looking to get rid of us. You can kind of charge what you want at that point and they're going to stick with it. And although you don't want to squeeze a customer for every last penny, you don't have the pressure of like competing on price or things like that because you've just supported them the whole way through and you've kind of made your name and made your reputation with the customer of just being your trusted scheduling, hosting, payment, you know, partner.
What did you think Calendso was when you built it initially?
A fun side open source project that I had no idea if it was going to take off. You know, back in those days, I was building literally everything. I built stuff in cybersecurity. I built stuff in finance. Who knows? I was just kind of making some random stuff, seeing if it would take off. And Calendso was just another bright idea. Something as well, which, you know, day one, I was like, okay, I'll make this open source. It makes sense, you know, into the future. But even then, I wasn't thinking too hard about commercialization. And it was only a month after working on it when we actually launched at about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, where I kind of took a break from my desk and I was watching the whole day, all the launch metrics. We were number one and, you know, like racing against everybody for upvotes. And I was like, wow, this could be an actual company. And then I really started to think about it more and more. And I'm like, great, well, this is open source already. Here's where I could see open source playing into our future. Here's not. I can't say anything was too intense at the start, to be perfectly honest. But once we then realized that this had some serious potential, we started to, you know, put the serious hat on and think about how does this play into our future. And, you know, we came up with a pretty solid strategy, a strategy which 3.5 years later, we're still following that same playbook. I expected to have revised and switched directions and things like that. Maybe some things worked, maybe some things didn't. But because we really sort of took the time to think about this stuff in the early stage seriously, it played out pretty well. And then that's the thing as well with a good startup founder, as I was saying earlier today, a good startup founder is somebody who's a visionary. You know, you're crazy and you're bullish about an idea and you think whatever your next thing is, it's going to be huge. But also in the same sense, you have to think about like the strategy of how you're going to get there. And as long as you can balance those two things, then, you know, you're going to have a really solid business model.
So you kind of put this thing out there because you said, how cool would this be? Or this is interesting. And this is kind of one of many things you were sort of exploring at the time and tinkering with. Then it started to like really take off. And you started to say, what could this actually become? So that's sort of when the bigger vision starts to come into play. And what was that transition from? This transition was from, this is kind of just like a cool sort of open source, self-hosted Calendly, to like, this is now going to be this Stripe for time, or like what was there some sort of intermediate step, or did you already have the Stripe for time when you launched this thing on Product Hunt? Like how did that all sort of come together?
It's funny because we worked backwards
Yeah.
almost. So like I said, day one, we always wanted this to be an infrastructure thing. But the idea is to be so deeply embedded in every other thing. We never fully expected to be competing with Calendly.
Yeah.
Not because we didn't believe we could make a better product, but because, Calendly is huge. And I didn't want to bet everything I had on, taking on somebody who's already so big. The idea from the start was infrastructure. But I built the MVP, and although it looked very different to what Cal.com looks now, it had a pretty fresh, sleek design. It was all it was in the early days of Tailwind, where that kind of design was like the most attractive thing anybody had ever seen. Before this became another hype train and everybody builds their sites looking like Tailwind. And a few people looked at it, and part of the hype around our launch was like, wow, this is a really sleek looking product. And people were like, I'd actually like to use this in place of Calendly. And so we began with looking at infrastructure, but there was so much overwhelming demand for people to actually use this as their regular scheduling link that I was like, okay, well, that's what we'll tackle first. We created it as a typical SaaS product. You sign up, and it was a freemium model at the time. There was an actual paid individual plan. It had certain features like
kind of hosted and all that.
Yeah, and it was fully hosted as well. Originally we weren't even thinking about hosting it as a proper SaaS.
Because Calendso, there wasn't this proposition of we're going to do any hosting for you back when you first launched, right?
When we thought about it, not really. This was infrastructure. This was customizable stuff. Our eyes were entirely on infrastructure.
Can people implement this into their applications?
Exactly.
Calendly exists.
We were fine with that. We were happy to sort of coexist with them. But it's that overwhelming demand that got us to actually then focus on individuals / consumer SaaS first. And so what was the original purpose, the infrastructure stuff, then became the last thing. Because we built individual stuff, and then people said, okay, I have a small team. I want to be able to round robin between people on my team. I want to use this in small sales situations and things like that.
Sure.
So we built the Teams plan. And we were doing more and more SaaS stuff. And then we were getting tons of inbound from enterprises, people with hundreds, if not thousands of people. And they say, okay, I want to use this in my sales team. I want to use this in customer support. I want to use this in, the IT teams. I want to use this in everything.
Were a lot of these people switching from Calendly, or were they switching from some older sort of archaic thing? Or
mostly Calendly.
Okay.
Calendly do very well in sales.
Sure.
And so they've gotten good roots.
What was causing that they just say, hey, we're looking at renewing contracts, so we just want to kind of look at what else is out there? Or is it you guys were relatively fresh, young, didn't necessarily have maybe the trust associated that something like Calendly would have, it being a much older company, much more established? What was the thing that was causing people who are pretty significantly big organizations with real sales teams and things like that to say, hey, we should look at this upstart?
The thing that played our favor is that Calendly aren't an entirely product-driven company. If you look into Calendly, they're very sales-driven as a company, whereas we're the opposite. We're product people at heart. We have one salesperson.
Sure.
So first of all, people don't love Calendly. Personally, I think that Calendly is, especially at least at a basic SaaS level for an individual or just a couple of people, I think it's a perfectly fine product. I'm not here to hate on Calendly at all. But there are products you use which really delight, and Calendly is not one of them. And that's definitely a sentiment that a lot of other people feel. And that is what often triggered people to look. Also, when contracts come up for renewal, people just look around to see what's out there. There is software that I have been happy, but not overwhelmingly loved. And I've just gone ahead at contract renewal stage and been like, okay, what else is there? And that's led us to switch quite a few times in a variety of areas.
How many people work at Calendly, or do you think? Do you have any sense?
Calendly have about 600 people.
600 people?
And yeah, they're really not a ton of product people. I mean, if you look at what Calendly are, a lot of salespeople. They also have like an entire team of full-time like legal counsels and things like that. And I'm like, why do you need that? Like they do a lot of things other than just build. Which is where we were like, okay, well, this is our opportunity to dive in with like a team of almost entirely engineers and product people. And when we try to hire people, we hire people with a good sense of product. We get the right designers on board and things like that. And we really try and like slot in where they don't. And of course that got us on the map. But yeah, you said before about we were young, there's no trust in us. And so we did a few things. Number one, we raised a lot of money. We raised $32.4 million across a seed and a Series A.
It was a huge seed. Huge. For what I know ODF invested a small amount. I invested a small amount, but I couldn't believe how large of a round this was.
Yeah, I mean, of course, on one hand, this was peak of 2021. The hype train for all startups was, in full speed. So, of course, crazy valuations, crazy big rounds. But there was also a lot of strategy behind it. We didn't just jump along and be like, yeah, let's raise a ton of money because we can. We raised more money than what we needed to. And the reason behind that is we wanted to, inspire some confidence in like the security of Cal.com. When we're going and selling to these enterprises, the question is like, I told you earlier, open source is sticky. When you go from nothing to something huge with this infrastructure there, like what would you do if AWS disappeared?
Yeah.
That would be crazy. You literally trust, you bank on Amazon being a thing in the same way that you like care that your bank doesn't fail. You care that AWS doesn't fail.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with us. So for us to be able to demonstrate, okay, we have plenty of money in the bank. We have like infinite runway. Our burn has always been super low. We never scaled spending with the amount of money we raised.
I believe the investor updates say something like, well, yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to say what they say now, but like, in the past, it was something like over a decade, it was a really...
Oh, our runway, most of the time, I remember most of the investor updates would say the runway's between 25 and 30 years.
Yeah. So it was even...
I averaged around 27 years. It was quite funny to put that in the investor updates. Like, yeah, we're good for another 27 years before we'll die.
And it wasn't like you weren't spending money either. You just had a lot of money and you were spending money appropriately for the time. And
we were just very thoughtful about it. Hiring a global team with one set global salary, no matter where you work. So we're not hiring expensive Bay Area engineers. We just hire, a reasonable salary that's good enough for everyone, just across all geographies. But then the second thing that we did is what we call the longevity guarantee. And this is something where open source applies really well. We signed an agreement as both co-founders saying that if anything actually happens to the company, that the license to Cal.com changes to a completely permissive open source license. And that means all of the stuff which I said earlier, all of the commercial stuff that no individual would ever reasonably need, that stuff goes from being behind a commercial license to being under the most freely available license there is in open source. So this is the thing, Cal.com effectively cannot die. There's literally no way we'd go bankrupt, but theoretically, if we did go bankrupt today, the software goes nowhere. Yeah. And every single person that has, put all this time and investment into Cal.com, they don't lose anything. They just get access to the entirety of Cal.com and everything that's already been there. Also, this is open source, and this is a decently popular open source project. People will continue to maintain this off their own accord. We get incredible volume from open source contributors who, fix bugs and things like that. So even if every single one of our team members just disappeared off the globe, there's still a lot of people to keep this thing running, which is also a really cool feeling to have as a founder, that your company cannot die. It's become its own being that just kind of lives on forever, which is kind of beautiful in a sense. But that's another way that we inspired this confidence in when we did enterprise SaaS. But this is also just as applicable, if not more so, with the whole infrastructure stuff. This is the only way for us that we become so deeply embedded in everything. And we work with quite a few governments and things like this. And they care a lot about this stuff. They care about the open source. They care about this. Only today I was talking with a certain country's government, and they say, yeah, because it's open source, like I can actually sell this like within, the internal IT departments and things like that. They say, whenever I try to bring in any piece of software, they say, no, because governments are very conservative, with all the compliance and security and that kind of thing. And they basically say, okay, we won't use this new software because it could, create compliance headaches for us. With open source, there's no, like, nobody can give me a decent argument as to why not to implement an open source piece of software, because, from a compliance standpoint, it basically eliminates any problem you may have. And that becomes really powerful when getting embedded in huge companies or governments or things like that, or creating, the infrastructure that powers the hundreds of millions of bookings going into the future. We've always said our goal is to connect 1 billion people by 2031. We're very much on track for that. I know it sounds like a crazy goal. It's pretty realistic for what we're doing. And I hope that we'll even far surpass that. But you've got to think about, what does creating 1 million bookings or connecting a billion people actually mean? And how do we structure ourselves as a company that we're that important that we can actually connect 1 billion people?
That pledge that you made, the two of you, around sort of releasing everything completely open, should some cataclysmic event happen for Cal, what was sort of the precedent behind that? Was there a precedent behind that? Was that something that you guys came up with? Was that something that someone suggested who had done something with open source, commercial open source before? What's the backstory behind that?
I've never seen it anywhere else, and even still, I don't see that as something that's copied that often, which is a shame, because if there's anything to copy for open source companies, I would say, do that. It's a great thing to do.
Have you thought about open sourcing the document and putting it out there?
Yeah. It's like anybody can and sign the same thing.
So you already put it out there?
It's completely public. Same as like all of our licenses and stuff like that. That's all out there. We got a lot of inspiration from the way that we structure our like commercial licensing through GitLab. They were a great source of inspiration. But yeah, when it came to the longevity guarantee, that was something that we just came up with, because all throughout Cal.com, me and my co-founder have both been very involved in sales. We've understood the hesitancy that people have. We understand all this stuff that goes on. And when we did get some like early stage hesitancy, we thought about it like, what can we do? And then said, okay, well, let's sign an agreement that basically makes this as stable as you can possibly get. I get on calls since then with even the most conservative and hesitant people, and they're like, oh, yeah, well, I don't really want to employ this new software. And I'm like, right, we're open source. We have a longevity guarantee. We have the funding. We have this. We have that. And I just watched as I just knocked down every possible doubt or objection that they could ever have to this. And then they're kind of left with like, oh, yeah, I don't really have any other problems. Yeah, we can use this. And that is the thing that like closes the deals. That is the thing that gets you into some of these companies. It's crazy.
I think that's a really interesting pivot point to, you as a salesperson, you as somebody who's doing commercial business with Cal.com. You started this when you were 17. You're 21 now. What was that like? At what point did you find yourself trying to sell infrastructure to foreign governments? Like that's such a space that I would imagine people to have extremely high hesitancy. You talked a little bit about kind of the way that you might handle objections, doing things that are completely unprecedented, like the longevity guarantee. But what was that like? When did that happen in the company's lifestyle that you started talking to governments and actually successfully signing them?
Surprisingly, well, talking to governments and things of that scale surprisingly early on. Although I can't disclose who,
sure.
Within like the first week of us launching it, the MVP, we were in pretty serious talks with like let's say one of the top 5 companies in the world to use originally Calendso, and then this thing was still a terrible MVP. Like, there's no way we would have ever closed them. At the time, it was so lacking in functionality. But the fact that it was open source, the fact that we had all of these things, it sparked an interest from them, and they said, look, we either use Calendso or we build this ourselves. And it's all these things that started to like make us realize also, something that many software companies go through. They go through SOC 2 compliance, ISO 27001, all of these compliance frameworks and things like that, because, to sell to large companies, those are the guys with the hesitancy, and you get these compliance frameworks. And I did all of that stuff myself in-house. So I really got to have an understanding for security and compliance. Always was kind of into cybersecurity and that, but got to learn a lot about the compliance and things like that behind it. And although compliance is a little bit more of a dry and boring topic, but it's a very important one, especially if you're trying to build something that's even remotely in the realm of Cal.com or any of these other, similar strategy companies that we talk about. You have to understand the compliance in businesses to then understand, what's going on in their head. And now, I get on calls and I'm talking about data residency, or I'm talking about encryption and things like that. And because like I did a lot of that compliance myself, and I understand, what the requirements are in the industry, what the general asks are in the industry, I jump on a lot of calls now, and compared to the average salesperson who doesn't know too much about that, I know how to sort of like cut down people's objections and cut down their hesitancy. And I think that's something that's really good to look into for any founder who's doing sales, or really anybody who's doing sales. Look into your company's compliance, learn what the possible objections are. Everybody has the same set of questions. It's like, oh yeah, like how is my data protected? Something that people ask me, how can I make sure, especially being a startup, a lot of startups have, all of their engineers have access to their production database with the customer information. And if you want a big company to use you, you need to assure them that like not just anybody can start like pulling out your data, especially when you've got, imagine like big financial firms and things like that. The things that are on their calendar, that's deal flow. You could be talking about like huge market shifts and things like that that's sitting on their calendar, critical information, or like healthcare, things like that. And I need to go to people, I'm like, okay, yeah, so all of our employees, they're background checked, 2FAs in force, we have all these security controls, we have that. And then they're like, oh, okay, great. Like they can tell that you're employing a very comprehensive strategy behind this sort of thing, as long as you put yourself across as being somebody who's quite serious and mindful of that compliance. And yeah, to sell to any of those kind of demographics, that is always needed. And I'm pretty much the compliance guy within our company, but anybody else who's taking sales calls, whether it's our sales guy or whether it's my co-founder, they're often like referring customers to me just to get on a call, and they'll come with their list of worries, and it's just to go and knock out all of those worries. Sometimes open source helps with some of them, but also some of it is just down to the company having good compliance, and also really knowing how that stuff works, as opposed to just knowing, oh, my company is SOC 2 compliant.
It reminds me a little bit of some other founders who are really great, and they get so into the details and understanding of sort of how their customers' businesses work and what their customers need, that they're as good or maybe much better than the average person who works at the company when it comes to understanding what's necessary and sort of the various challenges. There's a founder in ODF, Lauren Self, who is building a place for people to buy homes online. She's phenomenal, and she's done so much to understand the underlying real estate industry, especially when it comes to mortgages. That she knows more than the average person that she talks to, who actually is going to be doing the mortgages for these home buyers. And that the degree that you can get in the details and really understand that seems to be like such a valuable thing when it comes to actually doing the selling. And it it seems like one of the major failings that you see with startups is they don't necessarily founders don't necessarily take the time to really get into the weeds there so that they can do that objection handling.
Absolutely. And the thing is most of the time, we don't need to be salespeople, especially as founders. We are solutions architects. And this is something which I've really learned with dealing all this, because of course there was one day where I joined my first sales call. I have no sales background, no sales experience, never read a book on sales, and I'm like, okay, let's try and be a salesperson. And the point is, you don't have to. You don't have to be that typical salesperson. You don't have to give a customer a hard sell. The thing is, especially for what we do, you're looking at what does the customer need? How can I solve it? And especially for something like Cal.com or anything that's a bit more flexible, a bit more infrastructure level, you're looking at, okay, how can we make this work for you? What are your requirements? How can we use these different features of our product or something like that to meet your needs? And so honestly, I leave the sales stuff and I don't do follow-ups. I don't do, all those typical salespeople stuff. I leave that to our actual salesperson. But for pretty much every big deal that we have, I'm jumping on a call as well with the customer and just helping them break down things. And that's something that we get uniquely as founders. I try to understand every bit of technology within it, know every single thing about the product, even as the years go on and we build all sorts of random stuff that in my own usage of Cal.com, I don't use half the features of Cal.com because I just use it to take pretty standard bookings. But I try and understand every single feature that even the largest enterprises will do. I understand the compliance, I understand this, and I just kind of dip into every bit of that knowledge just to come up with a good solution for a customer. And they often feel so reassured when you just kind of come to the table with that confidence. You're like, yeah, of course, we can do this. How we can do this is we use this, and this. Because then you don't sound like it's, empty promises or anything like that. You really sound like you know what you're talking about.
Because
it's the same way that you use investment advisors or things like that. If somebody can tell you exactly how the markets work, you're like, well, you know what you're doing. I trust you with my money. We're all just trying to come up with solutions for each other.
Maybe we should land the plane here and just close with some thoughts about how people should think about building infrastructure companies. I think that in some ways, one of the most important things you can build is an infrastructure company because it allows more people to build things, right? So many people probably wouldn't actually be able to build the things that they're going to build with Cal.com because it would have been too cost prohibitive for them to do it.
Yeah.
There's so many small businesses bootstrapped apps and companies like that wouldn't have been able to build the whole scheduling infrastructure. And you're really unlocking this ability, similar to Shopify or similar to Stripe, for more people to do things online that are productive and good for, for themselves and for the world or maybe for their communities. How should you think about building an infrastructure company when it comes, what's your case for open source versus closed source? And maybe what's just your case for building infrastructure companies in general?
I don't do startups. I don't do Cal.com or anything for the money or any of the typical reasons why you'd think. I never sat there and thought about, what can I build that makes me the most money? I care a lot about impact and just pure achievement. I want to get to the point where Cal.com is a $20, $30 billion company, not because of what that means for me in my financial sense, but just because that's some kind of measure of achievement. And infrastructure companies are the most amazing way to do that. Infrastructure is how we can have the most impact on the world. I care about, 20 years time, being able to look much like WordPress can, where Matt can say, oh, wow, look at all these companies using WordPress. It's powering so many people's way of life, from, these small flower shops to huge companies and things like that. It's a really beautiful thing to see. Every single time I see a use case of Cal.com, whether it's, before the in Brazil, if you wanted to pick up your ID card, you just have to queue, maybe in the dark, in the rain. It was a first come, first serve. It was terrible. Now you can just, book appointments, and it's much easier. You just turn up at your time, and like we're saving people from having to like sit out there in the rain. Refugee camps, using Cal.com, to help coordinate services and things like that. That's amazing. These things make it all worthwhile. There's such an inspiration. It's lovely to see what you've built, spread to all those people and create all that good in the world. Infrastructure, I think, is absolutely the best way to do it. I could be out here, building pure B2B SaaS or something like that, but no, I want to look bigger than that. And I think for anybody that truly cares about that, go for it. It's definitely a difficult path. B2B SaaS is probably the most straightforward. Everybody knows exactly how the roadmap is going to go, and that's fine. Infrastructure is something where you have to be a trailblazer. You have to build some very, very complex things. At day one of Cal.com, we knew what we wanted to build was absolutely insane. Nobody's built it ever. We need to build such a wide range of things, and we need to be the one platform that just covers every single use case. Everything that people want to do with time, we need to be able to serve. And that's crazy. It's a very, very steep hill to climb. But once you get to the top of the hill, you've climbed all the way up here. The results are massive, and what you can do is you can watch as you grow into becoming a true foundation of the internet, where you can walk around in life and you can just see all of the things around you which use what you've built. And that is why I look to WordPress, that every time you build a web, or when you browse the web, you know that that's been built on WordPress. That Stripe, whenever you're punching things into the checkout, what's the chances that that's Stripe? Even when if I pay my taxes on the government website in the UK, they're using Stripe under the hood, and that's like, wow, yeah, I'm using Stripe there. Or for Cal.com, every single appointment you book, that is so rewarding. And I don't think it hugely matters whether it's open source or not. You can build huge infrastructure companies, whether it's open or closed source. I think open source enables you to go a little bit further. We get to find that out. We'd love to be at Stripe size, but we believe that if we do get to Stripe size, we can possibly push even further than that in terms of reach because of open source. We can cover that extra little bit that requires the deep customization and integration that open source has. So, I think for most of us, it doesn't really matter whether we get to Stripe or slightly beyond Stripe, because who knows whether we'll even, get there in the first place. But open source is a good way as well to take the infrastructure that you're building and just put it in the hands of everybody. One of the things that I love to say that we do is we democratize access to scheduling. That people who cannot afford these, complex setups and expensive SaaS solutions and things like that, they're able to access Cal.com scheduling for free.
This is amazing. I really wanted to set a new sort of high watermark for just ground covered, interesting discussion. I just learned so much. Thank you for doing this. We shut the entire office down. They're cleaning up. They're throwing away the trash. It's 11:20. Thank you for doing this, man. This has been great. And I think that people are just going to really enjoy hearing about your philosophy around open source, hearing about sort of how you should think about building infrastructure companies. The why behind it is really valuable. So thank you for being here. And I'm really hoping that we can do this again, maybe a year or something, and check back in on cal.com. I just know that it's going to be an incredible year for you all.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed what you listened to, stay tuned because we've got a lot more coming your way. We do this because we like to showcase the conversations that happen in and around ODF, which is the community where people go to explore what's next. And if you're interested in joining that community, our next cohort starts November 8th, and you can learn more at joinodf.com. In the meantime, feel free to subscribe for future episodes. We've got a lot more coming your way. And if you really enjoyed it, we'd always appreciate you leaving a review or a like. Thanks again, and we'll see you very soon.